This series of readings is entitled The Maine Indians from the White Man's Point of View. Our first reading was written in the 1860s as the Civil War is ending in America. In the West, war is being waged between the United States and the Indian nations. In Maine, Father Eugene Vetramil is pastor of the Passamaquoddy Indians. He is also studying and writing about their culture and traditions. The title of this piece is The Legend of Pamola by Father Eugene Vetramil. The Penobscot Indians believed that an evil spirit called Pamola, he curses on the mountain, resided during the summer season on the top of Mount Katahdin, the greatest of mountains. They offered sacrifices to him to appease him, so that he should not curse them or otherwise injure them. Although they hunted and fished in the woods and lakes around Mount Katahdin, yet they never attempted to go on the top of that mountain, in the assurance that they would never be able to return from that place, but be either killed or devoured by the evil spirit Pamola. They pretended to have seen this spirit on the top of the mountain on several occasions while hunting or fishing around it. It was but till late that they have attempted to ascend the mountain. It is not long since that a party of white people desired to go to the top of Mount Katahdin and took some Indians to accompany them as guides. The Indians escorted them to the foot of the mountain, but they refused to go further, fearing to be either killed or devoured by Pamola. No persuasion from the party could induce them to proceed further. On the contrary, the Indians tried to dissuade the party from ascending the mountain. Speak to them of this evil spirit and how many Indians had been killed and devoured by him, and that no man ever returned who dared to go to the Mount Katahdin. The Indians, however, were prevailed upon to wait for the descent of the party, who, in spite of the remonstrances of the Indians, ascended the mountains by themselves, without guides. They were quite surprised to see the party back, as they entertained no hope of their return, believing with certainty that they had been killed or devoured by Pamola. It would not be improper to give a brief episode of the Indian tradition concerning this evil spirit Pamola, residing upon Mount Katahdin, a mountain famous among the Indians of Maine, a tradition which is believed by the Indians unto this very day. They relate that several hundred years ago, while a Penobscot Indian was encamped eastward of Mount Katahdin in the autumn hunting season, a severe and unexpected fall of snow covered the whole land to the depth of several feet. Being unprovided with snowshoes, he found himself unable to return home. After remaining several days in the camp, blocked up with drifts of snow, and seeing no means of escape, he thought he was doomed to perish. Hence, as it were, through despair, he called with a loud voice to Pamola several times. Finally, Pamola made his appearance on the top of the mountain, and the Indian took courage and offered to him a sacrifice of oil and fat, which he poured and consumed upon burning coals out of the camp. As the smoke was ascending, Pamola was descending, and the sacrifice was consumed when this spirit got only halfway down the mountain. Here the Indian took more oil and fat and repeated the sacrifice till Pamola arrived at the camp, and the Indian welcomed him, saying, "You are welcomed, partner." Pamola replied, "You have done well to call me partner. Because you have called me by that name, you are saved. Otherwise, you would have been killed by me. No Indian has ever called on me and lived, having always been devoured by me. Now I will take you on the mountain, and you will be happy with me." Pamola put the Indian on his shoulders, bid him close his eyes, and in a few moments, with a noise like the whistling of a powerful wind, they were inside of the mountain. Now the Indian describes the interior of Mount Katahdin as containing a good, comfortable wigwam, furnished with abundance of venison and with all the luxuries of life, and that Pamola had wife and children living in the mountain. Pamola gave him his daughter to wife and told him that after 1 year he could return to his friends on the Penobscot, and that he might go back to this mountain to see his wife any time he pleased and remain as long as he wished. He was warned that he could not marry again, but if he should marry again, he would at once be transferred to Mount Katahdin with no hope of ever going out of it again. After 1 year, the Indian returned to Old Town and related all that had happened to him in Mount Katahdin and the circumstances through which he had got into it. The Indians persuaded him to marry again, which he at first refused, but at last they prevailed on him to marry. But the morning after his marriage, he disappeared, and nothing more was heard of him. They felt sure that he had been taken by Pamola into Mount Katahdin as he had told them. Now this fact filled the Indians with consternation, and they conceived a great fear for this evil spirit. Yet a young Indian woman constantly persisted in refusing to believe even in the existence of Pamola, unless she saw him with her own eyes. It happened one day that while she was on the shores of the lake Amboctictus, Pamola appeared to her and reproached her with her incredulity. He took her by force, put her on his shoulders, and after a few moments of flight, with a great whistling of wind, they were in the interior of the mountain. And there she remained for 1 year, was well treated, but was got with child by Pamola. A few months before her confinement, Pamola told her to go back to her relations, saying that the child that was to be born of her would be great and would perform such wonders as to amaze the nation. He would have the power to kill any person or animal by simply pointing out at the object with the forefinger of his right hand. Hence, that child was to be watched very closely till the age of manhood, because many evils might follow from this power. But when the child grew up, he would save his own nation from the hands of its enemies, and he would confer many benefits on his people. If she should be in need of any assistance, she had nothing to do but to call on Pamola in any place she might be, and he would appear to her. He warned her again not to marry, because if she should marry again, both she and the child would at once be transported into Mount Katahdin forever. He then put her on his shoulders in the same manner as he had done in taking her up to the mountain, and left her on the shore of the lake Emboctictus. She returned to Old Town, and when she related all that had happened to her, and also that she had seen in the mountain that Indian of whom I had made mention above, the child was born, and she took great care of him. She called several times on Pamola, who always made his appearance to her. And when she wanted any venison, either into the woods or in the river, she had but to take the child, and holding his right hand, she stretched out his forefinger and made it point out to a deer or moose, and it at once fell dead. So also in a flock of ducks, which she made the child's first finger single out one of the flock, which likewise fell dead. The child grew and was the admiration and pride of all. It happened one day that while he was standing at the door of the wigwam, he saw a friend of his mother coming. He announced it to her, and at the same time, with the first finger of his right hand, he pointed at him, and the man immediately dropped dead. This fact caused great consternation, not only in the mother of the child, but also in the entire tribe, who looked on him as a very dangerous object among them. Everybody fled from his company, and even from his sight. And the mother called on Pamola and related to him what had happened, and also the fear and the consternation in which she and the entire tribe were. Pamola told her that he had already warned her to watch the child, because the power conferred on the child might produce serious evils. He now advised her to keep the child altogether apart from society till the age of manhood, as he might be fatal with many others. The Indians wanted her to marry, but she refused on the ground of it being forbidden by Pamola, who was her husband, and in the case of marriage, she and the child both would be taken up Mount Katahdin. However, the Indians prevailed upon her, and she married. But in the evening of the marriage day, while all the Indians were gathered together in dancing and feasting for the celebration of the marriage, both she and the child disappeared forever. Now this is, of course, a superstitious tale made up by the prolific imagination of some Indians, yet we can perceive in it some vestiges of the fall of the first man in having transgressed the command of God, and how it could be repaired only by God. We can also trace some ideas of the mystery of the incarnation of the Son of God in the womb of the Blessed Virgin Mary, mixed with fables, superstitions, and pagan errors. The appearance of God to Moses in a burning bush upon Mount Horeb may be glimpsed in Pamola appearing to the Indian on Mount Katahdin, and so forth. Yet these are but conjectures.
Before I begin to read our next selection, I have been asked to make the following statement. In the story I am about to read, the term squaw was used several times to refer to Indian women. Today, that term is considered offensive by most people. At the time the story was written, however, the term squaw was not considered that offensive, and more importantly, was not intended to be offensive by the author of this story. For the sake of literary and historical accuracy, therefore, we shall read this important story exactly as it was written by its author in 1938. The Pillars of Smoke by Elizabeth Coatsworth. A few mornings later, something happened for which Margaret had not dared to hope. When the possibility occurred to her, she dismissed it quickly, not wishing to allow her mind the comfort of delusion. Last year it had not taken place, and she had no reason to expect it this year. Nevertheless, when on this particular morning she stepped out into the early dawn with her milking pail in her hand and glanced, as always, toward Horn Pond, she saw two thin pillars of smoke rising quietly into the sky and drifting away into the blue. The water lay very still and mirrored the pillars with a faint sparkle of silver. It was so long since she had seen here any smoke but her own. She stood leaning against the door frame, gazing out quietly at the rising smoke, letting its message slowly fill her heart. She was sure that she knew who had lighted the cooking fires and who sat about them now, there across the pond near the water's edge. It was just where her father and she had seen them 2 summers ago on a morning such as this. He had gone down to welcome the strangers and had found a family of wandering Indians headed by an old bow-legged and rum-smelling man dressed in cast-off English clothes and a red flannel waistcoat, who said that he was called Captain Bob Bandy-Legs, and that the rest were his sons and daughters and their husbands and wives. They had at first been rather sullen with the white man, pretending to speak little English, staring at him with the black, expressionless eye which some people liken to a snake's. But Miss Winslow had been patient with them. After a while, he found that they were accustomed to come here on certain summers when the mood struck them to plant the corn in the clearing where his cabin now stood. Where were they to plant now? What right had the white man to seize their clearing and to drive them away from the places which had always been their hunting and fishing grounds? For once, they found a settler who agreed with them. True, he had bought the land, but from white men who had no real right to sell an Indian clearing, and very willingly he bought it back again from Captain Bob Bandy-Legs, paying for it with blankets and an iron kettle and an old musket. As to the hunting and fishing rights, he freely left them to their original owners. Surely the land was large enough for them all. But the friendship had been cemented by a far more human incident. One day, Mr. Winslow and Margaret saw the old man coming up the slope, holding something in his arms. This something proved to be a favorite grandson, little more than a baby. And when the white man saw the small hand, swollen and dark-looking, and the child's hot face, he looked grave indeed. "Fish hook," said Captain Bob. "Try larch cones. Try spruce gum. No good. You try." "I'll do what I can, Captain Bob," said Mr. Winslow. "But mind you, I can't promise. Margaret, bring me clean lint, thyme water, and mallow ointment." She could see him now, deft and careful, hurting no more than he could help. She could see the child still in his grandfather's arms, trusting the white man, and stoical in spite of his littleness. Margaret made up a bed for him in the corner by the hearth, and there he lay for 3 days with Captain Bob sitting beside him and her father redressing the wound at all hours of the day and night. She could see the men's heads bent together over the small, tortured hand, or Captain Bob gravely feeding the child with broth. In 3 days the worst danger was over, but for a fortnight Captain Bob brought the child with him every day to have his wound redressed. Now, as Margaret stood leaning against the door frame, remembering these things, she saw once more 2 figures climbing the slope. They might be climbing out of the past, except that now the little boy was thinner and taller than he had been, no longer half a baby. Quickly she shut Ajax into the cabin, since he was a stranger to these people, and with Rambler bounding ahead, hurried down to meet the newcomers. Captain Bob eyed her black dress. "You are alone?" he asked directly. "My father is dead," she answered, sure of his sympathy. He made a gesture with his hands. "The leaves fall," he replied. There was a beautiful calm look on his face that seemed to have nothing to do with his body in its ill-fitting, ill-matched, and dirty clothes. He said very little, but walked with Margaret about the farm. "The hay is ready," he remarked at last. "Yes," she answered. She did not tell him how she had already taken the sigh and spent long, back-breaking afternoons in the upper field with so little accomplished that she felt sick with discouragement. He praised her corn, for she had planted only the Indian crops of corn and beans and squash, together with a few potatoes, since these were the crops that would bring the largest yield at the least cost of strength. When they came back to the cottage, she invited Captain Bob and the child in, laid a new cloth, and brought them fresh milk and cornbread spread with wild strawberry preserves. She saw the old Indian glance about the room. "All is the same," he said. She nodded. "Only he is gone," she thought to herself. Gravely, the man and the little child ate and ate. At last, they pushed back their chairs that her father had made, with deerskin seats. But when Margaret asked, "Are you through, Captain Bob?" the Indian shook his head. "I'm resting," he said, and in a few moments fell to again and ate as much more. Every time she saw it, the girl was surprised at the quantities that Indians could eat when there was food to be eaten. The other side of the coin, she knew, was how little they could live on for weeks and months even, when food was scarce, and with what patience they starved and waited for the gift of food to come once more from the hand of the Good Spirit. When her guests were gone, Margaret went about her work as usual and saw no more of the Indians that day. But next morning, when the first light was graying the room, she was awakened by the sound of voices outside the cabin, a lovely sound indeed to her ears, and hurrying to the door with her hand on Ajax's collar, found on the great fieldstone doorstep 2 perch gleaming in the morning light. And beyond, in the middle of the dew-drenched field, she saw a group of 3 or 4 squaws, Captain Bob's daughters and daughters-in-law, each armed with a sharp knife and busy cutting hay. It was still too early in the morning for the grass to fall easily, wet as it was, but already they had made a wide swale, and seeing her at the door, they called out to her, smiling, and then went back to their work, close bunched together, talking as busily as a flock of blackbirds in a field of stubble. Margaret, excited and happy, cooked and ate the fish quickly, did the necessary chores in the barn, and then joined the women with her sigh. All day the great clouds crossed the blue sky. All day their shadows crossed the hayfield where the winds were making pulsing cat's paws down the slope. All day the Indian women worked with Margaret among them, cutting valiantly. And although the girl perhaps never learned the whole art of the sigh, she did, working with renewed hope, learn to take more time for whetting her blade, and slowly came to feel the proper swing and jerk of the handle in her hands, which had escaped her when she was working alone and made desperate by the magnitude of the task. So, deserted by her own kind, Margaret was befriended by the shadowy people of the forest, and by their help the hay was made and finally carried into the barn. She sometimes felt as though she were living in a dream. For the first few days the women had been shy with her and hid their faces, giggling when she spoke to them. But one day during the haying, as she sat resting a little apart from the others, an older woman came up to her and, shaking her head, felt her shoes, whose thick soles were almost worn through. "No good. Molly molasses make moccasins," she grunted. And in a moment the brown girls were clustered about Margaret, touching, feeling her clothes, laughing, exclaiming over the smallness of her feet, the reserve suddenly broken through. Molly Molasses made Margaret take off her shoes and stockings while she marked a pattern on the deerskin which one of the young women brought from the camp. And then the whiteness of her feet, untanned by sun and wind, brought forth another volley of the exclamations. They begged her to pull up her sleeves and unfasten her collar. "All over birch bark," they cried, and giggled again. From then on, there was no formality between them. They watched her milk Laura and Daisy and drank the warm milk. They shook their heads over the time she spent in keeping her sheets white and fresh, when to their minds a bed of balsam boughs and a bearskin would do as well and make much less work. They peered into a delicate mirror and laughed to see their own brown faces there. They handled her cups and dishes, sneezed at the smell of her dried herbs, wondered at the cats, looking at everything and exclaiming over everything, but did no harm to anything. For well over a week, the winds held from the southwest, hot and dry, fine weather for haying, but wearying for flesh and blood. Still the women worked on uncomplaining, and at dusk they would beg Margaret to sing to her harp, which was a never-failing wonder to them. It seemed strange and beautiful to the girl to sit in the falling dusk, with the light of the fire moving faintly on the walls, and sing the old ballads of another world, while the Indian women sat motionless on the floor, watching from the dark, pensive faces. There were 'twas sisters in a bower, Benori, oh Benori. There came a night to be their war, by the bonny Mildams, oh Benori. He courted the eldest with glove and ring, Benori, oh Benori. But he loved the youngest, a boon a thing, by the bonny Mildams, oh Benori. What went on in those shadowy minds? Margaret wondered as she sang. What did they understand of love as the Scotch had sung it? But whether they were moved by the very strangeness, or by the haunting sadness of the tune, or by Margaret's hands plucking the strings, they called for the ballad again and again. They would have listened until late in the night if at last Molly Molasses had not risen from her seat on a drawer pulled out from the chest. She always refused a chair, and wakened the others from their dream, saying that Margaret must rest. And in a moment more they would fade into the dusk, and Margaret would be left once more to her solitary housekeeping, watched now only by the attentive eyes of the hounds and Chloe and the green-eyed kitten. It was a curious and happy time for Margaret, a period of truce with the forest, when she went as silently as the Indian women in her new moccasins decorated with strawberries of dried porcupine quills. Molly had refused all payment for them, except a single penny, which she added to a store kept in a doeskin pouch worn about her neck, apparently as a charm. "I take out penny," she exclaimed. "I see who gave it. See him big, what him doing. Him well, him sick. I see everything." The Indian men never appeared until after the last armful of hay had been carried into the loft of the barn. But then Captain Bob and 2 or 3 of the younger men suddenly took form, carrying a haunch of venison which the women roasted over an open fire, while Margaret, weary but at ease now for the stock during the coming winter, made johnny cake and opened her preserves with a reckless hand. When the little feast was over, the girl, standing apart with Captain Bob, tried to give him her purse with the cheese money, but the old man looked at her kindly from his brown wrinkles and refused to take it. "I can't do anything for you in return, Captain Bob," she said. He touched his grandson with his hand. "Your father turned back his feet from death," he answered simply. For a time, Margaret was able to forget all dread and live in the summer. She lived, however, like the bees, full of her labors, and not like the grasshopper churring and skipping in the stubble. There was much to be done, but nothing to be faced, at least not now, at least not while the leaves were green and the game plentiful, at least not during these days that were still so warm, when the birds were still busy with their final broods and had not yet thought of the south. One August day, Margaret paddled across the pond with the Indian women to gather blueberries and raspberries on the moors that covered the low hills. At noon, she happened to find herself alone with Molly Molasses sitting in the shade of a rock. Their birch bark baskets were heaped with berries,